All right, that's the kind of singing I have every Sunday morning before I preach. I don't like song leaders that get up and before you preach and lead in the hour of trial. I want to hear something exciting and enthusiastic because I need all the help I can get. This is a wonder. Yeah, amen. That's the wrong place. That's the wrong place to say amen. One time I said to a fellow, he said, I meant to say amen this morning. He said, you said, I could be wrong about this. He said, I want to say amen. I said, no, I don't need your help. Please don't help me. This is a wonderful thing. I've been here before. My wife and I have enjoyed it very much. They put on a great program here, and they've invited good speakers that you'll get to go hear, and you will enjoy that very much. I have to tell you, though, that we're listening to what Tim said a while ago. He said he had to kind of hold himself to stay there. But let me tell you, he came down from Oklahoma Christian, and we spent 12 whatever weeks together we had. And I know the heavens won't open up and a dove won't come down. But I want to say this is an intern in whom I'm well pleased. Well pleased. He has done wonderful things. He came with talent, and I tried to help him with the other part besides the talent, and he did a wonderful way. Well, my theme tonight and my assignment is that I'm supposed to talk about a funny thing happened on the way to heaven. I couldn't help but think a moment ago when they were singing the song, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. They tell me that one preacher never could get his gestures straight. And so he got them all mixed up. He said, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. So you got to, when you're practicing preaching, you got to get the gestures to coordinate. I like to come and talk to this group because when we get this kind of group together, we've got the people who are the cream of the crop in the church, the people of vision, the people of tenacity, the people who are creative. Oh, and by the way, we're glad to have the men, too. The women always want to applaud that. I don't know why. I have been preaching 60-plus years. I have been in local work 56 years. I have been at the same congregation 50 years now, in the 50th year. And so I do have some observations to make about the church and the funny things that happen on the way to heaven. I visualize this as when you decide to go into ministry, which may be preaching, it may be teaching, it may be an elder or a deacon. But when you visualize that, I see it as going to the head of a path, and there are two paths. And no matter which path you take, one may be ministry, but if you take a path, there's always signposts along the way. And if you take the ministry path, you see that it says, warning, tears ahead. You're going to need a Kleenex box in your office for the counseling cases. And you're going to find yourself overcome with grief at times on many a gravesite. But the thing that surprises you is that there's a lot of laughter along the way. With all the seriousness they expect of ministers and those who serve God and who are extremely religious, they're always expecting that you are going to be just nothing but serious. And yet funny things happen. For instance, for the young preacher, he goes for his first interview. He said, I have my bachelor's degree, I have my master's degree, and he might even say I had my PhD. And the church says, sit down, son, we'll teach you the rest of the alphabet. And that's what happens. There are always those practical things. One fellow left a small town, and he told everybody, and they all knew about it. He said, I've decided I'm going to preach. And so he went away, and he came back in about a month. And the fellow said, I thought you were a preacher. He said, you made the same mistake I did. One fellow went to, he'd been preaching and he'd done the 2 years in the cloud of dust thing several times. So he said to his friends, he said, look, he said, I'm tired of going from one church to the other. I'm going over here this time and I'm going to stay a long time at this church. And he was back in 9 months. And they said, I thought you were going to stay a long time. He said, listen, 9 months at that church was a long time. Well, when I think about preachers trying to be with churches and churches trying to find preachers, I think about the difficult things that you have to do, things that are disappointing and things that you say, is there a better choice out there? It's like the fellow who was kind of madly in love with this girl, and he was kind of an ugly fellow, and he was uncouth. And so he said to her one day, he said, Melissa, would you marry me? And she said, no. And he said, Melissa, is there someone else? And she said, there's got to be, Henry. Well, you'll find yourself in ministry hoping there's someone else or someplace else sometimes, but that goes with the territory. Now, when you decide to support yourself or make your living or have a career, what do you want to call it, by speaking, either by teaching or serving with it, whatever you decide to do, you will always come across that terrible disease that afflicts a lot of cattle. It's called hoof and mouth disease. You actually say things that you just hope you'll never say. I preached in West Texas for the first local work, and I got up one night and I was going to talk about a particular thought, and I was quoting Jeremiah. And I started to say Jeremiah, and when I said Jeremiah, it suddenly hit me in my brain. You know, it's going real fast when you're up talking. And I thought, that wasn't Jeremiah, that was Daniel. So I said, and I started to say Jeremiah. I said, Daniel. Well, let me tell you, when I got down, they said, you know who you quoted tonight? I said, who? They said, Jack Daniel. I said, no way I quoted Jack Daniel. But I went back and got the tape, and it was Jack Daniel, clear as a bell. So I hold the record of the only preacher in the Church of Christ who's ever quoted Jack Daniel to make his point in his sermon. I also, when I was in Breckenridge, Texas, I stood up one night and I was kind of waxing the elephant, as they say. And I was really going, and I got to a point in the story of Moses' life, and I said, Moses refused to be called the daughter of Pharaoh's son. And I didn't catch the reaction, so I just repeated it for emphasis. So one of our deacons came out, he said, you know, I bet it did make him mad. One of the worst ones I ever did, though, was my wife was there to testify. We were we're going into a store, actually a grocery store, and we met this woman, and she walked up to me, and she, you know, preachers, you all have this experience. You think, who in the cat hair is this? And she talked, and she talked, and she knew me so well. And I thought I knew her too, but I couldn't figure out, where did I know her? And finally she said, don't you know? Said, I'm the one you came to see every day when you were out visiting. And I in the hospital, and I said, oh, I didn't recognize you with your clothes on. I wish you could have seen the horror-stricken look on my wife's face. I thought, I believe I've said something wrong here. But I saw her day by day in that small town and coming to that hospital, and she had on a white gown. And I'm telling you, I didn't know the woman, but I try to be more careful how I say that. I just say, I don't remember you now. Well, when you make messages like that, I have a preacher friend that has the perfect answer when people kind of jump on you because, well, you didn't do this very well, and you don't preach very well, or your stories are terrible, or you just don't quote enough of this. Here's his response. He looks at them and he says, you know, you're right. I don't do that very well. But he said, I have forgiven myself for that. That's a great line. I've forgiven myself. And I've had times to use that myself. I love the one where the guy met a fella and he remembered him as a friend. He said, listen, he said, how's your wife? He said, oh, she's in heaven. He said, I'm sorry. He said, you're sorry? My wife's in heaven? He said, no, I'm not saying I'm sorry. I'm glad she's in heaven. He said, you're glad? And finally he said, well, I guess I'm just surprised. So, you be very careful. You know, Winston Churchill wasn't a churchman, but he had a lot of things that preachers a lot of times need repartee. You need to be able to come back with something. And Winston Churchill was at a party one night, and he was just really bad. He just wasn't acting his best self. And this woman came up to him, and she said, Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee. He said, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. Now, that's perfect. They also said to him one night when he was drunk, they said, Miss Churchill said, you're drunk. He said, I know it, and you're ugly. And in the morning, I'll be sober, and you'll still be drunk, be ugly. He was in the House of Commons one time, and the fellow was making a speech, and as he made the speech, Winston was doing his head like this. And he remarked, he said, Mr. Churchill, he said, I'm only expressing my personal opinion. And he said, I am only shaking my personal head. Sometimes, you know, you find yourself wishing you had that exact retort, and you think of it next day or next week. But you're going to need that in preaching. I love the fellow that wrote the poem. I don't know who did it, but he said, my preacher's eyes I've never seen, though light in them must shine. But when he prays, he closes his eyes, and when he preaches, I close mine. You're always trying to get the approval of the audience, to get their attention, to get them to go along, to hear the relevance of what you're saying and how it applies to their life. But you wonder sometimes what people come up and tell you. I love the woman that went up to the preacher and she said, oh, brother, she said, every one of your sermons is better than the next one. Yeah, you know, see, that sounds so good. You have to think about it. And you don't want your sermons to be getting worse and worse, but she found a really nice way to say it. I have to tell you, though, this is on a serious note. For those who preach or those who teach, sometimes, you know, when you're a young preacher, you're always hoping that you're going to get the approval, and they come and say, that's a good sermon. That was great. And some do come say that, and some don't. And sometimes you hear what you don't want to hear. I had a fellow at Waterview that walked out one day, and he's one of these guys that never gave a compliment. And he walked by me, and he said, brother, that was a good sermon today. And I said, well, thank you, Paul. And he started walking on, and he thought better of himself, and he turned around and he said, of course, you realize they aren't all good. So someone's always there to kind of stick a pin in your balloon and make you not feel good. But what do you do? Well, I want to explain to you the people who are going to lie to you. There are two classes of people who lie to you. Your enemies lie to you, and they tell you you did terrible when you did good. But your friends will lie to you, and they'll tell you you did good when you did terrible. So what's a boy to do? There's only one thing that will never lie to you. The audience. Watch them. And if you wonder, if you're a young preacher and wonder how you're doing, look at the audience. That's one of the reasons why Tim and I worked on preaching without notes, because you can watch the audience like they watch you. And if you'll listen to the audience and watch the audience, they'll always tell you how you're doing. You say, well, you're getting too old, you ought to quit preaching. The audience will tell you that. You don't have to listen to your friends or your enemies. Just watch the audience. They'll say, I believe it's about time for you to go, you know. And you can see them go glassy-eyed. Now, in preaching, though, there are problems that you have to deal with. And one of my favorite stories is the story of the old Jewish rabbi. And he had his men came to him, and they said to the old rabbi, they said, Rabbi, some of our men say that we can only pray to God standing up. And the old rabbi said, that is not our tradition. And they said, well, some of the other men say, though, that they can only pray sitting down. And he said, that is not our tradition either. And he said, Rabbi, and they fight like cats and dogs. He said, that is our tradition. Ever been to those meetings? My other favorite song, or favorite theme of the song of how people do in meetings and how much they listen or how much they are reasonable. That's always an interesting thing. The rabbi had his committee together, and his committee for the synagogue, and he was presenting a new program. And there were 10 men there, and those 10 men had the audacity to turn his project and his program down. And it really made him angry, and he was hurt. So he stood up there in the conference room, and there was a storm outside, but he stood up and he looked at those men, and he lifted his hands and he started praying to God. He said, God, I have presented this wonderful plan. And he said, they have outvoted me 10-1. And they're not going to do it. And I want you to express yourself. And about that time, a lightning bolt came through the ceiling, split the table half in two, knocked everybody out of their chairs, and finally the head of the synagogue came up with his glasses hanging off of one ear, and his hair was on fire. And he looked around and he said, okay, so you got the vote of the Lord. It's still 10-2, and we have the majority. Have you ever known anybody like that? That's the kind of thing that you often see. I read something this last week, though, that interests me. They said the preacher had put in 20 years, and they were giving a little celebration. And those people who'd worked with him the closest said, you know, Brother Jones said, you've really done a wonderful work these 20 years. And we have just marveled at how well you've done, and said that there were just times when we were just so overcome that we just almost told you we appreciated it. But we resisted it. And now today, at 20 years, we want to tell you, you don't always get the kind of appreciation you'd like to have. You don't always, in fact, you usually get credit for things you didn't do as well as you could, and you get more credit for things that you, or don't get as much credit for things you did. But, you get caught up in what they see is what they think, and then you have to deal with it. But those kind of problems are such that you find yourself sometimes just depressed or discouraged about it. They asked Daniel Boone one time, said, have you ever been lost? He was a great frontiersman. You ever been lost? He said, no, I've never been lost. He said, I was bewildered one time for 3 days, but I've never been lost. And I'd like to say that to the problems we face, that we do at times get bewildered. And I want to quote that old famous theologian, Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra said, leadership is keeping the 5 guys who hate you away from the 100 guys who are undecided. I'm not sure that's not right. It sounds good to me. Now, one of the things that I would like to point out to you, though, is that many times when you lead, when you teach, when you preach, whatever you do, it's very easy that when something comes up, and particularly people all around you are saying it, this is what the situation is, and there is nothing that can be done. I got to tell you, that is not a factual statement. I hope you realize that. I've kind of devoted my whole career to not believing that. Because, you see, if you stand around a while, somebody will pass you doing what you said couldn't be done. Or time will pass on and all of a sudden you'll get an insight. You'd say, if I just do this, this would happen. But if you say it can't be done, you close the book. What we need to say is, I don't know what to do to fix that now. That's a fact. You don't know, and I don't know. But if you stay with it, you may actually find out how to do it. And that's a great thing. But when you do what you've done and when you've made the choice you obviously have, I want to quote what Basil Barrett Baxter said some years ago. He said, God only had one son, and he was a preacher. Very interesting insight in God's family. There's a poet that most of you are aware of. Robert Frost wrote a poem called The Road Not Taken. 2 roads diverged into yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent into the undergrowth. Then I took the other, just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I should be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. The road sometimes is hard. It's filled with tears, but it's filled with laughter too, and joy. And you've chosen the right path.